Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about the pharyngeal arches and the role they play in development of the head and neck. And the easiest way for me to actually get across how this works is to do something a little bizarre. We are going to start by talking about fish. And we're going to talk about how the gills that we see in fish correlate really nicely to the pharyngeal arches that we see in human beings as they develop, and how those structures, by understanding how they operate in fish, make a little more sense about how they develop in people. So first things first, this is a fish. Here's the jaw, and posterior to that we've got some cartilage right here. These slits, these cartilage rods are forming the core of the various gills that the fish use to breathe. So if we were to take a slice right through the mouth, back this way, we'd see something a little bit like this, where the individual gills have slits in between them that allow water to go through and for oxygen, CO2, to be exchanged with the blood vessels in the fish's circulatory system. So as water flows through, passes each gill through the slits and gets exposed to the capillaries that are therein and allows gas exchange to happen. Now, for the gills to do their job, they have to be relatively stable, relatively stiff, so there are cartilage rods supporting each gill. No big deal there. But for gas exchange to happen, we also have to have vessels, and in this case, each gill receives its own aortic arch. And the aortic arches, I've talked about a little bit already in a specific video on YouTube, so feel free to check that out and see how the aortic arches create the vasculature that we know in the mature human. But in both fish and in developing mammalian systems, we've got aortic arches inside each one of these gills alongside the cartilaginous rods. And the gills also have muscles, and if you've got muscle, you need to have a nerve. So each gill contains cartilage, vessels, the aortic arch, muscles, and each one of these muscles receives a specific cranial nerve from the central nervous system. So here we've got a slightly idealized brain and cerebellum right there, and paired cranial nerves coming out, one cranial nerve per set of arches. So that's how fish are set up. And if we just do a little bit more and color in the pertinent embryology right here, we're going to see how the different areas of the gill correspond to the trilaminar embryo. And just to push my other video a little bit further, if you haven't seen the difficult concepts of early development talk, please go check that one out, because that'll make this a heck of a lot more understandable. But if you got a good handle on that, we'll just keep going. The lining of the digestive tract, and in this case the lining of the mouth, each of one of the gills, the pharynx, and the esophagus in fish is coming from endoderm, colored in yellow here. The skin on the outside comes from ectoderm, and just FYI, so does the central nervous system. So the spinal cord, brain, brainstem, etc. That's colored in blue. Ectoderm covers the outside of the fish as well as us. And then finally, everything in pink here is derived from mesoderm. Mesoderm's giving rise to the muscles, the connective tissues, and the other structures in that area. Now, bones and cartilages of the gills and of the pharyngeal arches don't come from endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm per se. They come from mesenchyme, or undifferentiated cells, that arise from neural crest cells. And if you remember from the earlier video, neural crest cells are derived from ectoderm. It involutes, follows the neural tube in, but thereafter those neural crest cells migrate all over the body. They form ganglia, they form melanocytes, and one of the things that they form are the connective tissues, the bones and cartilages of the face and the neck. So in this case, the pharyngeal arches, getting those structures from neural crest cells. Whoops. Now the muscle in this area is coming from somites, or to be technically correct, semitomeres in the head region that migrate in here and pull their innervation along with them. Now, that's fish. Really, mammals, aka humans, have about the same setup going on, but since we're not breathing water, since we don't have to have gas exchange occur through these gills, we've filled in the area in between, and we're left with something that looks like this. We've still got the same endoderm, yellow, ectoderm, blue, and mesoderm, pink, that we had in the fish. But since we don't have gills, these are now going to be called pharyngeal arches, and the only opening into this area is the primitive mouth, or the stomadeum, located right there. So the endodermal line stomadeum leads into the early oral cavity, pharynx, and eventually to the esophagus way back here. And each one of these arches, pharyngeal arches, has the same stuff that we'd expect that the gills had to have: a cartilage, a aortic arch, a muscle, and a cranial nerve. So that's what we're looking at right here. Now, I apologize for making the brain and spinal cord smaller in the mammal than the fish. That was artistic license / laziness, but I think you get the point of cranial nerve, cartilage, arch, and muscle in each one of these pharyngeal arches. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at the same structures from the outside lateral view, and we see something that looks a little like this. So the pharyngeal arch muscles and their innervation correlate really nicely to groups of nerves and muscles that you've probably already studied in gross anatomy. So right here, we've got the developing eye, the nasal placoid right here, stomadeum, or the early mouth, to be tucked in right behind here if we could see it, and hanging out at the base of the neck behind the stomadeum, we've got the pharyngeal arches. And there's arch numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. That is not a typo. The fifth pharyngeal arch develops in some species, but not in humans. In fact, there's disagreement whether there's a vestigial fifth arch that goes away or whether it just flat out doesn't form at all. But structures of the sixth pharyngeal arch in other species are correlated with the structures of the sixth arch in humans. Hence, we've retained the nomenclature 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. So enough of that confusion. Let's move on to something else. Let's look at the nerves that innervate each one of these arches. So coming from the brainstem, and the spinal cord that's been drawn in here, we've got a variety of nerves, cranial nerves coming down, and the first arch is innervated by the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5. But those of you who've been studying your anatomy will find a neat little correlate here. The first ophthalmic branch and the second maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve don't innervate any muscles. But the third innervates the muscles of mastication, the muscles that you use to eat. And because of that, all the muscles of mastication come from the first pharyngeal arch. So the masseter, the temporalis, the medial and lateral pterygoids, as well as the anterior belly of the digastric muscle and the tensor tympani in the middle ear all come from this first arch because they're innervated by the trigeminal's mandibular branch. We go to the second arch, and the second arch gives rise to all the muscles of facial expression, and no big surprise, is innervated by cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. So all the muscles of facial expression start in one place, and then as they migrate around the face, they drag their nerve supply with them into 5 distinct branches: the temporal, the zygomatic, the buccal, the mandibular, and down in the neck, the cervical branch of the facial, are all derived from the fact that these muscles migrate all over the face and drag their nerve supply with them. Now, the posterior belly of the digastric, the stapedius muscle in the ear, and the stylohyoid muscle also come from the seventh, they're innervated by the seventh nerve, therefore they all come from the second arch. Now, next up is pharyngeal arch number 3, and this one's great because it's innervated by cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it forms a single skeletal muscle. A single pharyngeal arch derived muscle is innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, and that is the stylopharyngeus muscle. So keep track of him as a piece of trivia. That is a muscle innervated by cranial nerve 9 that assists us in swallowing by elevating the pharynx. Now, after that exercise in minimalism, we get to the fourth pharyngeal arch, innervated by the vagus nerve, and this guy is immense. The vagus nerve and the fourth arch gives rise to all the muscles of the palate, all the muscles of the pharynx. So pretty much anything innervated by cranial nerve 10 inside the mouth and the pharynx is derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch, but not the laryngeal muscles. The laryngeal muscles are also innervated by the cranial nerve 10, the vagus, but they're innervated specifically by its recurrent branch. And the vagus nerve actually sends off its recurrent branch, loops around the aorta on the left and the subclavian artery on the right before it makes it back to the sixth arch. And these This place is where those laryngeal muscles come from. So all the laryngeal muscles come from the sixth arch, with the exception of the cricothyroid muscle, which is the one not innervated by the recurrent branch. So hopefully this is correlated to the anatomy a little bit. If you're not taking anatomy right now, please, please, please don't freak out. Just look into your course materials and make sure what you do and don't need to know. All right, so we'll go in the recurrent fibers of the vagus right there to the sixth arch, and we'll move on. All right, so a little short summary of what we just talked about here is that the pharyngeal arches give rise to a variety of structures, but if you can keep track of the innervation, it makes a little more sense. So the first pharyngeal arch is innervated by the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, so all the muscles of mastication, the tensor veli palatini, the tensor tympani, the mylohyoid, the anterobiliary digastric muscle, anything you can think of that's innervated by V3 comes from the first arch. And the cartilage in the first arch directs the formation of the maxilla, the mandible, and in the middle ear, the malleus and the incus, which makes a little sense. If you remember, the tensor tympani attaches to the malleus. Makes sense that they'd have a common origin. Second pharyngeal arch, same theory. We've got cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, innervating muscles of facial expression. On top of that, you've got the stapedius, stylohyoid, and the posterior biliary digastric muscles, also coming from the second arch because they're innervated by cranial nerve 7. And the cartilage associated with it directs the formation of the stapes, the styloid process, and part of the hyoid bone. And again, the stapes and the stapedius are closely related, so it makes sense that they'd have a common origin. Third pharyngeal arch is the easiest of the bunch. Cranial nerve 9 innervates one muscle, the stylopharyngeus. It's the only muscle the third arch gives, and the cartilage associated with it forms part of the body in the greater horn of the hyoid bone. Now we move on to the fourth and sixth arches, and rather than going into extreme detail, let's just say that the fourth arch is innervated by cranial nerve 10, innervates the palatine muscles, innervates the pharynx, so the superior, middle, and inferior pharyngeal constrictors, innervates the cricothyroid muscle on the external aspect of the thyroid, of the larynx, and then the sixth arch, innervated by the recurrent branch of cranial nerve 10, gives rise to the laryngeal muscles, and those are going to be the muscles that control the opening and closing of our vocal cords. So the posterior cricoarytenoid, lateral cricoarytenoid, all of those guys in the larynx are innervated by the recurrent branch of cranial nerve 10, and hence came from the sixth pharyngeal arches. Now, the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches share the formation of the laryngeal cartilages, and that's very complex, so we're going to kind of gloss over that right now, and instead move on to the ectoderm and the endoderm lining the pharyngeal arches inside the developing mouth, because that's where the next set of cool things is going to be happening. Hi everybody, and as promised, we're going to start in now with structures formed by the pharyngeal arches that are related to the glands and some other structures of the mature human being, apart from the arches themselves. So let's start with what we know. We'll draw in here that first arch, same view that we were looking at before, second arch right behind it, third, fourth, and don't forget, no fifth, but a sixth arch right in there. So on this side, on the left here, what we're going to do is we're going to work on early development. So early development structures are going to be drawn in here on the left. And then across on the other side here, I'll draw in the little stomadeum, early mouth right there. This is where we're going to have the mature structures. So on the right, going to kind of show what structures on this side form on this side, although keep in mind it's all happening together on both the left and the right. So the first arch we talked about already is going to be innervated by the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, innervating muscles of mastication. Second arch, cranial nerve 7, innervating muscles of facial expression, plus a few oddballs. Third, innervates stylopharyngeus, and that's innervated by cranial nerve 9. Fourth arch, vagus nerve, going to the palate, pharynx. And then sixth arch, also innervated by 10, but it's the recurrent branch of the vagus nerve, innervating the laryngeal muscles. All right, so that's what we've covered so far. Now let's concentrate on what's happening on the outside. And the outside, as you recall, is lined by ectoderm. So we'll draw that in blue, just like we had before. And the ectoderm forms these little pinches right here. That's going to form what we're going to refer to hereafter as pharyngeal grooves. And sorry if my hand is smearing the paper. I'm a lefty, not much I can do about it. Likewise, on the inside, we've got the arches lined by endoderm. I'm going to color that here in yellow. So endoderm in yellow on the inside, ectoderm in blue on the outside. All right. And we had grooves in between each arch on the outside. On the inside, endoderm forms pharyngeal pouches. So pouches inside, grooves outside, and these guys are going to form various structures. In between the first and second arch, we've got the first groove and the first pouch. Between the second and third, second groove, second pouch. I think you guys can see where this is going hereafter. And the fourth groove and fourth pouch are hanging up between the fourth and sixth arch. I think everybody probably has the idea there, so we're doing good. Now, let's move over to the right side and talk about what these guys do in an adult, or as we develop, actually prior to, not even adult, before we're born. Most of this is already well established. The first pouch and the first groove invaginate a bit towards each other. So right here, we've got a channel that invaginates from the inside and that almost meets a channel that invaginates from the outside. So between the first and second arches, we've got these folds. And these folds are going to form most of our ear. This is happening at the level of the ear. So the first pouch invaginates right there. And it's actually going to form most of the inner and middle ear, along with the pharyngotympanic tube, aka the eustachian tube that connects the middle ear to the pharynx. And if we got the inner and middle ear coming from the pouch, no big surprise that the first groove invaginates to form the external ear. And the first and second arches contribute to the auricular hillux that will then form the mature ear right there. All right, so that's what's happening with the first pouch and the first groove. Now let's move on over here and talk about the second, third, and fourth pharyngeal grooves. We're going to talk about those all at once because what they do is actually pretty easy. They go away. As development happens, these guys get kind of pinched off from the outside, and they form a little cluster that's surrounded by the growing ectoderm. So right here we've got our second, third, and fourth pharyngeal grooves, but as the ectoderm around them grows, they get kind of pinched off. Now they remain connected for a little while to the surface by this little guy right here. This is called a cervical sinus. And specifically, it's an external cervical sinus that's going to connect these embryonic grooves to the outside. And occasionally these will persist in adults, and you'll find somebody with a little hole on the side of their neck just beside or anterior to their sternocleidomastoid muscle. Might leak a little bit of sebum because it never went away. But in the majority of us, these guys get completely sealed off from the skin. So the skin right here is continuous, and for a little while there's a tiny little cervical cyst that remains. And again, those can stick around in some adults, and you get a little swelling in the neck as a result of that getting a little inflamed, but generally they go away. And what most of us are left with is the big zero right there, just some smooth skin on the outside of our neck, and that's all. So the first groove creates part of the external ear, grooves 2, 3, and 4 give us nada, give us nothing. So that's easy enough. We'll draw that in over here. My artistic skills aren't the best, but I can draw nothing. Pretty happy about that. And ectoderm lining that smooth neck all the way down. Now here's where we get to have a lot of fun. The second, third, and fourth pouches do contribute a lot of stuff. Second's pretty easy. It forms a little depression. No surprise, lined by endoderm. And it's going to be the tonsillar bed. It doesn't actually contribute the tonsil or the immune tissue of the tonsil. That migrates in a little bit later, but it forms the bed of the palatine tonsil. A little further down the pharynx as we go. And next, what's going to happen is our third and fourth pouches give off a dorsal and ventral kind of a bleb, and they both give off this little bleb dorsally and ventrally before they condense back down to form the rest of the pharynx and proximal esophagus. And we'll color in the endoderm that lines it right there. But we're going to take a little pause and not talk about those guys right now, because there's another structure I want to talk about, and brings up one little truism of the formation of the body, is that endoderm likes to give rise to glandular material. And one of the glands that arises from it actually develops on the floor of the embryonic mouth. A little bleb of endoderm extends just kind of inferiorly from the bottom of the mouth. And it's doing so just near where the tongue is forming. So we have some tongue buds forming anterior to it, making up the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. We got a couple tongue buds forming posterior to it. But this guy is referred to as the thyroid diverticulum. And as the body grows, this diverticulum extends inferiorly and essentially migrates to the base of the neck, below the cricoid cartilage, goes down past the hyoid bone, and forms kind of a butterfly-shaped gland, typically, on the front of the cervical muscles, strap muscles, and that's going to be our thyroid gland. I bring that up first because these third and fourth pouches actually contribute things that are related to the thyroid gland. So, for whatever reason, here we go, third, fourth pouch, the dorsal extension of the third pouch gives rise to the inferior parathyroid gland. And likewise, the dorsal extension of the fourth pouch gives off another one. It gives off the superior parathyroid gland. And these guys migrate to the thyroid and then hang out. Inferior parathyroid down here, superior parathyroid up here. And this is happening on both sides. Now, why does the inferior come off the third? Why does the superior come off the fourth? You got me. I have no idea, but that's how it works. And they're going to hang out here and produce parathyroid hormone, which is involved in upregulating the amount of calcium in our bloodstream. Now, let's jump back here to the ventral extension of the third pouch. This extends inferiorly to become the thymus, which is another gland, which is more of an immune gland than anything else. And this is going to migrate inferiorly, even further than the thyroid did. It's going to migrate down to the superior mediastinum, just above and a little bit anterior to the heart, and forms a gland that looks in shape not unlike the thyroid. But the thymus is more involved in the maturation of B lymphocytes to become T lymphocytes and immune response. Pretty big in children. It rescinds as we get older, but it's coming off of that third pouch in the pharyngeal area. All right, now last up, and last up is actually literally correct here, we have the ultimobranchial, suddenly forgot how to spell, ultimobranchial body. I hate this word. What it means is ultimobranchial body, last thing to come from the neck. Great. Ultimopharyngeal body, it'll also be referred to as, what you need to know about is that it produces the C cells of the thyroid gland. And these guys produce calcitonin, and they lower your blood calcium by creating more bone, signaling osteoblasts to lay down more bone. There's more to it than that, but short story is parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium, and then the C cells produce calcitonin that lowers blood calcium. These guys also migrate to the thyroid gland, but instead of making nice little clusters like the parathyroids, they just get scattered throughout the thyroid gland, and you can find those C cells in a histologic section with a little bit of looking around and not too much trouble there. All right, so that is what comes from not only the pharyngeal arches, but also the pharyngeal grooves and the pharyngeal pouches. And long story short, if it's a gland anywhere in the body, likely it comes from endoderm. It's not universally true, but it's pretty much the generic truth going with that. I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you guys in the next video.